March 1936 in the cold, cavernous halls of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. It was 11 a.m. when Adolf Hitler gathered his top military advisors and industrial titans to confront a problem that haunted his dreams of continental conquest. To the west, the French had constructed the Maginot Line, a series of subterranean fortresses, reinforced concrete bunkers, and heavy artillery batteries that stretched from the Swiss border to the Ardennes. It was widely considered the most formidable defensive barrier in the history of warfare, designed to break the back of any invading German army before it could even cross the frontier. Hitler knew that if he were to fulfill his destiny of dominating Europe, this wall of steel had to be shattered, and conventional artillery simply would not suffice. He didn't just want a gun. He wanted a miracle of engineering that would rear the very concept of a fortress obsolete. Later that afternoon, around 3 p.m., the Führer sent a formal request to the leadership of the Krupp Company in Essen. The Krupp family had been the primary armorer of the German state for generations, and in Hitler's eyes, they were the only ones capable of forging a weapon of such apocalyptic proportions. The requirements he laid out were staggering. He demanded a weapon capable of punching through 7 meters of reinforced concrete or a full meter of hardened steel armor plating. It had to be able to do this from a safe distance, well beyond the reach of French counter-battery fire. The military high command watched with a mix of awe and skepticism as the Krupp engineers, led by the brilliant Dr. Erich Müller, began the preliminary calculations for a caliber of gun the world had never seen before. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the patriarch of the industrial empire, personally oversaw the project, recognizing it as the ultimate opportunity to cement his company's legacy. By the time the final designs were presented in early 1937, the sheer scale of the machine was terrifying. The caliber was set at 80 centimeters. To put that into perspective, the shells alone would stand taller than 2 grown men and weigh over 7 tons. This was no longer a piece of field artillery. It was a mobile monument to German industrial might. It would be named the Schwerer Gustav, though the second gun produced would later be known by the more intimate name, Dora. Construction began in earnest at the Krupp workshops, but the logistical hurdles were almost as immense as the gun itself. Because the weapon was intended to weigh over 1,350 tons, it could not be transported on any existing road or single rail line. The engineers had to design a custom 4-track railway system just to support the weight of the carriage. It required 2 parallel railway lines for the gun to move forward and backward for aiming. Hitler was obsessed with every detail, frequently checking in on the progress and demanding that the weapon be ready for the planned invasion of France. However, the complexity of the 80-centimeter barrel, which was over 30 meters long, meant that the manufacturing process was plagued by delays. When the invasion finally happened in 1940, the Maginot Line was largely bypassed by the German panzers moving through the Ardennes, rearing the giant gun technically unnecessary for its original purpose. Yet, Hitler's fascination with the project never wavered. For him, the gun was more than a tactical asset. It was a psychological statement. It represented the triumph of the will and the supremacy of German science. The construction of Dora became a black hole of resources, consuming thousands of tons of high-grade steel and the labor of thousands of workers at a time when the German war machine was already feeling the strain of a multi-front conflict. The project reached a turning point in late 1941 during a final inspection that took place at 2:15 p.m. at the Rügenwald Proving Grounds. As the massive barrel was elevated toward the sky, those present felt the weight of history. It was a weapon designed for a type of warfare that was already beginning to fade, a relic of a siege mentality in an era of blitzkrieg and high-altitude bombing. Yet, the sheer ambition of the Dora gun remains a haunting testament to the mindset of the Third Reich. It was the ultimate expression of Hitler's bigger is better philosophy, a manifestation of a regime that believed it could simply outbuild and outsize any obstacle in its path. As we look back at the origins of this steel leviathan, we see more than just an engineering feat. We see the beginning of a descent into industrial madness. The Dora was a weapon of incredible power, yet it was also a symbol of a fundamental strategic failure. It was too heavy to move easily, too slow to fire frequently, and too visible to protect. It stands as a poignant reminder that in the theater of war, the most massive tools are often the most fragile. It remains a legacy of iron and hubris, a giant that was birthed in the dreams of a dictator, only to find itself wandering a battlefield that no longer had a place for it. The vision of ultimate firepower had been achieved, but at the cost of a reality that the Third Reich was never truly prepared to face. January 1937 in Essen, Germany, the engineers at Kruppagi were handed a task that defied the conventional laws of ballistics and logistics. Adolf Hitler demanded a weapon capable of shattering the concrete heart of the Maginot Line, and what his designers delivered was a mechanical titan that redefined the limits of heavy industry. To understand the sheer scale of the Schwerer Gustav and its sister gun, Dora, one must look past the propaganda and into the terrifying mathematics of their construction. The heart of this monster was its caliber. At 80 centimeters or nearly 31.5 inches, the bore of the gun was wide enough for a grown man to stand inside. The barrel alone measured over 32 meters long, weighing a staggering 400 tons. Creating a steel tube of this magnitude required specialized casting techniques that pushed German metallurgy to its absolute breaking point. This was not merely a gun. It was a mobile fortress of iron and grease. The total weight of the completed assembly reached 1,350 tons, a mass so immense that no single railway track on Earth could support its weight while in a firing position. To move this behemoth, the gun had to be dismantled into several major components and transported via a fleet of specialized trains. Once it reached its destination, a team of nearly 2,000 men worked for weeks to lay 4 parallel tracks and assemble the 2 massive bogies that would cradle the weapon. This assembly process was an engineering ballet of cranes and heavy winches, often starting as early as 6 a.m. and continuing long past midnight under the glow of searchlights. By 3 p.m. on a typical assembly day, the site would resemble a massive construction project rather than a military operation. The ammunition was equally gargantuan. The concrete-piercing shell stood nearly 7 meters tall and weighed 7.1 tons. To put that into perspective, a single shell weighed more than 2 fully loaded African elephants. When fired, the shell reached a muzzle velocity of 720 meters per second, allowing it to strike targets up to 47 kilometers away. For closer range devastation, the high explosive shell carried a 700-kilogram bursting charge, capable of creating a crater 30 feet wide. Loading these shells was a slow, mechanical ritual. It involved a massive hoist and a tray system that pushed the projectile into the breech, followed by propellant bags that were as large as small barrels. Because of the immense pressure generated within the barrel, the life of the gun was shockingly short. Every time the trigger was pulled, the friction and heat stripped away layers of the rifling. After only about 300 rounds, the barrel would be so worn that it required replacement or relining, an ordeal that meant sing the massive tube all the way back to the factories in the Ruhr Valley. Even the recoil was a feat of physics. To prevent the gun from ripping itself off its tracks, an elaborate hydraulic buffer system absorbed the energy of the blast, though the entire mountain of steel would still lurch backward several meters with every discharge. The logistics of firing a single shot were so complex that the gun could only manage about 14 rounds a day, even with the crew working at a feverish pace. If a firing sequence began at 11 a.m., the next shell might not leave the barrel until well after 1:30 p.m. This lethargic rate of fire was the price paid for such overwhelming power. It was a weapon of static siege, born from a philosophy that assumed the enemy would remain motionless while the Reich slowly assembled its giant. As the war progressed, the technical brilliance of Dora and Gustav became a burden rather than an asset. While German engineers had achieved the impossible by creating the world's largest caliber weapon, they had simultaneously built a dinosaur in an age of mammals. The rise of strategic bombing and the increasing mobility of the Soviet Red Army made these giants vulnerable and cumbersome. They were masterpieces of a bygone era of warfare, where the size of the shell was the ultimate measure of strength. In the cold light of history, the engineering of Dora stands as a testament to the fatal flaw of the Third Reich's military vision. It was a regime obsessed with the monumental, believing that if they could simply build something larger, heavier, and more terrifying than their opponents, they could command the very fate of nations. But in focusing on the 800mm caliber and the 7-ton shell, they ignored the reality of the changing battlefield. The giant was a marvel of physics, yet it was a strategic failure. It remains a legacy of iron and hubris, a giant that was birthed in the dreams of a dictator, only to find itself wandering a battlefield that no longer had a place for it. The vision of ultimate firepower had been achieved, but at the cost of a reality that the Third Reich was never truly prepared to face. It serves as a reminder that the most formidable steel can be rendered useless when it is forged in the service of an impossible fantasy. February 1942, the industrial rail yards of the Ruhr Valley became the staging ground for a logistical operation that looked more like the migration of a whole city than the deployment of a single weapon. To move the massive Dora across the continent, the German High Command had to abandon all conventional notions of military mobility. This was not a gun that could simply be hitched to a tractor or loaded onto a standard freight car. Instead, it required a fleet of 25 specialized trains, some stretching over a kilometer in length, just to transport the disassembled components. The barrel alone, a 54-meter-long cylinder of high-tensile steel, required multiple heavy-duty flat cars linked together with pivoting bolsters to navigate the curves of the European rail network. Even then, the path had to be meticulously surveyed. Bridges were reinforced with additional steel pilings, and in some cases, the tracks themselves had to be ripped up and relaid to ensure the ground would not liquefy under the localized pressure of thousands of tons. As the components moved toward the Crimean Peninsula, the sheer scale of the human effort became clear. This was not the work of a single battery, but of an entire military ecosystem. The core of the operation was the Heavy Artillery Regiment 672, numbering nearly 1,500 specialized soldiers under the command of a colonel. However, these men were merely the tip of the spear. By the time the trains arrived at the designated firing site near Sevastopol at 8:15 a.m., on a crisp spring morning, the total number of personnel dedicated to the weapon had swelled to over 4,000. This included 2 full battalions of anti-aircraft troops to shield the behemoth from the Soviet Air Force, several companies of specialized technical engineers, and even a detachment of military police to maintain a perimeter of absolute secrecy. There were also hundreds of civilian laborers and prisoners of war forced to toil in the earth, excavating the massive firing pit and laying the 4 sets of parallel tracks that Dora required just to stand upright. The assembly process was a grueling marathon of engineering that lasted for weeks. At 7 a.m., every morning, the work crews would begin the delicate dance of lifting components that weighed more than most medium tanks. 2 giant gantry cranes, each capable of lifting 110 tons, had to be erected on-site first. These cranes were used to marry the massive chassis to the railway bogies. If a single bolt was misaligned, or if the leveling of the quadruple tracks was off by even a few millimeters, the entire structure risked a catastrophic collapse. The men worked in shifts around the clock, their progress monitored by observers from Krupp, who treated the gun more like a fragile scientific instrument than a weapon of war. By 4 p.m. each afternoon, the officers would review the day's progress, often finding that despite the labor of thousands, they had only moved a single segment of the breech into place. Once the gun was finally assembled, the nightmare shifted from engineering to operation. Loading a single shell was a process that redefined the meaning of slow. The projectile alone weighed 7 tons, and the propelling charges were so massive they had to be moved on specialized trolleys. The gun could only be fired about 14 times a day, and even then, the barrel had to be cleaned and inspected after every shot to prevent the catastrophic buildup of heat and pressure. It was a weapon that demanded everything from its masters but gave very little in return. The sheer amount of fuel, food, and ammunition required to keep the site operational put a massive strain on the local German supply lines, which were already stretched to the breaking point by the demands of the Eastern Front. As we look back at the gargantuan effort required to move and fire this beast, the tragedy of the design becomes apparent. It was a weapon born of a 19th century mindset, forced into a 20th century war of movement. Thousands of men were tied down, millions of Reichsmarks were spent, and the entire logistical capacity of a sector was diverted for a weapon that fired less in a month than a standard battery of field howitzers could fire in an hour. It remains a testament to the dangers of being blinded by the pursuit of the superlative. In seeking the biggest, the heaviest, and the most powerful, the architects of the Third Reich ignored the most basic principle of war, that a weapon is only as good as its ability to be used where and when it is needed. Dora was a masterpiece of iron, but it was also a tomb for the resources that might have changed the course of the war had they been spent on something more humble. It stands in history as a cold reminder that power without practicality is nothing more than a very expensive form of theater, a giant that collapsed under the weight of its own impossible demands. June 1942, the Crimean Peninsula, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and the imping thunder of a weapon the world had never seen. After months of grueling preparation and a logistical effort that rivaled the invasion of entire nations, the Schwerer Gustav, known to its crew as Dora, was finally in position to strike. This was not just a gun. It was a 4-story high industrial complex on wheels, a monument to the Third Reich's obsession with overwhelming, singular power. To even get the gun to the outskirts of Sevastopol, the German army had to build specialized railway tracks and clear entire landscapes. 5 trains, some over a mile long, carried the components of the beast, guarded by thousands of soldiers, anti-aircraft batteries, and specialized smoke units designed to mask its position from Soviet bombers. On the morning of June 5, 1942, at 11 a.m., the order was finally given to fire the first combat shot in the history of the world's largest rifled weapon. The process of loading a single shell was a choreographed nightmare of engineering, requiring hundreds of men and a series of cranes to lift the 7-ton projectile into the breach. When the trigger was pulled, the earth did not just shake. It felt as if the atmosphere itself had been torn apart. The muzzle flash was so immense it could be seen for miles, and the shockwave shattered windows in villages far beyond the immediate blast zone. The first shell traveled nearly 30 miles, hurtling toward the Soviet fortifications known as Fort Stalin. For the next 5 days, Dora methodically dismantled the defenses of Sevastopol. It was a slow, agonizing process, with the gun only capable of firing about 14 shells a day, due to the immense heat and pressure generated by each blast. However, what it lacked in speed, it made up for in sheer, terrifying penetration. On June 6, 1942, at 3 p.m., Dora achieved what many military historians consider its most significant feat. It targeted the White Cliff, an ammunition magazine buried nearly 100 feet beneath the seabed of Severnaya Bay. The Soviet engineers believed this facility was invincible, protected by layers of rock and water that no conventional bomb could hope to reach. But Dora's concrete-piercing shells were not conventional. One of these 7-ton monsters punched through 30 meters of solid rock, detonating the entire magazine in a blast so powerful it sent a mushroom cloud billowing over the harbor and capsized several ships nearby. Despite these moments of spectacular destruction, the reality of Dora's performance was far less efficient than the propaganda suggested. By the time the siege of Sevastopol concluded in July, The gun had fired only 48 rounds. Its barrel, designed to withstand the fury of such massive explosions, was already worn out, its precision fading with every shot. The sheer cost of its operation was staggering. For every shell fired, thousands of man-hours were consumed in maintenance, security, and logistics. While the German infantry struggled for every inch of the city, thousands of potential combat soldiers were tied down, simply keeping this iron giant fed and protected. When Sevastopol finally fell, Dora was dismantled and shipped north to the outskirts of Leningrad, where it was expected to repeat its performance against the Soviet Union's northern jewel. But the gun would never fire again. As the tide of the war began to turn and the Red Army launched its counter-offensives, the Germans realized that their miracle weapon was a liability. In a war defined by mobility, fast-moving tank columns, and air superiority, a gun that required its own railway system, and a small army to death, it was a relic of a bygone era. It was a dinosaur in the age of the tiger. The legacy of Dora is not one of military triumph, but of a profound, tragic delusion. It represents the pinnacle of a regime that believed engineering could substitute for strategy, and that size was a direct equivalent to strength. This massive construction of steel and blood served only as a witness to its own obsolescence. It was blown apart by its own retreating crew in 1945 to prevent it from falling into Allied hands, leaving behind nothing but twisted scrap metal and a cautionary tale. Dora reminds us that the most dangerous weapon is not the one that is largest, but the one that is most adaptable. It stands as a cold monument to the vanity of those who believe they can conquer the world with machines of impossible scale, forgetting that the weight of such ambition will eventually crush the very people who built it. The thunder of Dora has long since faded into the silence of history, a ghost of a war where the pursuit of the ultimate weapon led only to a very grand, very expensive, and utterly pointless ruin. July 1942. The scorched earth of the Crimean Peninsula served as the final stage for the only true moment of operational success for the massive gun known as Dora. While the German High Command celebrated the destruction of the Soviet fortifications at Sevastopol, a sober reality was beginning to set in among the engineers and logistical officers tasked with maintaining the beast. The most powerful weapon ever built was also the most immobile, a prisoner of the very tracks that gave it life. To move the 80-centimeter cannon even a few miles required a network of specialized double tracks, thousands of laborers to reinforce the ground, and a constant umbrella of Luftwaffe protection to prevent a single Allied bomb from turning the rails lines into twisted scrap metal. By 4 p.m., on the day the siege was declared over, the order arrived to dismantle the weapon. It was a process that would take weeks of grueling labor, involving over 4,000 men who were desperately needed on the rapidly shifting front lines of the East. The gun was next destined for the gates of Leningrad, where Hitler hoped to repeat the triumph of the Crimea. The massive convoy of 67 carriages snaked its way across the war-torn rail networks of Eastern Europe, a target so large and so slow that its movement became a constant source of anxiety for the German Transport Corps. When the weapon finally reached the Taitsi station near the Leningrad front, the crews prepared for another display of thunderous power. But the Soviet army had learned from the fall of Sevastopol. By the time Dora was being assembled on its custom-built semicircular tracks, the winter of 1942 had set in with a vengeance. The machinery froze, the hydraulic systems groaned under the sub-zero temperatures, and the planned offensive was cancelled as the Red Army launched Operation Iskra to break the siege. For months, the most expensive weapon in the German arsenal sat idle in the snow, a silent, multi-million Reichsmark paperweight. It never fired a single shell at the city. As 1943 progressed, the strategic situation for Germany grew increasingly desperate. The era of the Grand Siege was over, and the war had transformed into a conflict of rapid retreats and desperate defensive stands. Dora was hauled back to Germany for an overhaul, its massive barrel already worn out by the mere 48 shots it had fired in the Crimea. While the industrial heart of the Ruhr was being pounded by Allied bombers, Hitler's engineers were wasting precious high-grade steel and thousands of man-hours on a weapon that had become a logistical nightmare. There was talk of converting it into a long-range rocket launcher or mounting it on a motorized chassis that would have been larger than a city block. But these were the fever dreams of a leadership that had lost touch with the reality of industrial warfare. The gun was no longer a weapon of war. It was a burden that the retreating Wehrmacht could no longer afford to carry. The Giant's final deployment came during the Warsaw Uprising in late 1944. Pulled from its storage shed near Chemnitz, it was used to vent the fury of a dying regime on a city already in ruins. It was an act of extreme overkill that served no strategic purpose. A massive sledgehammer used to crack a nut. By 9 a.m. on the day of its final discharge, the weapon had become a symbol of everything wrong with the German war effort. It was too big to hide, too slow to move, and far too expensive to justify its existence in an age of jet engines and atomic research. As the Soviet armies crossed the Oder and the Americans breached the Rhine, the order was finally given to prevent the ultimate weapon from falling into enemy hands. In April 1945, in the dense woods of Bavaria near the town of Auerbach, the German engineers who had pampered the machine for years prepared it for its final. They did not use enemy fire to destroy it. They used demolition charges. A series of massive explosions tore through the chassis and the barrel, turning the pride of the Krupp factories into a mountain of mangled, useless steel. When American troops finally discovered the wreckage, they found it difficult to believe that such a thing had ever been operational. It looked less like a weapon and more like the skeletal remains of a vanished civilization that had sacrificed its future at the altar of technological hubris. The story of Dora remains a haunting chapter in the history of human conflict, a testament to the fact that the most impressive weapon is not always the one that is largest, but the one that is most adaptable. It stands as a cold monument to the vanity of those who believe they can conquer the world with machines of impossible scale, forgetting that the weight of such ambition will eventually crush the very people who built it. The thunder of Dora has long since faded into the silence of history, leaving behind only the realization that the pursuit of the ultimate weapon led only to a very grand, very expensive, and utterly pointless ruin. It is a ghost of a war where engineering was used to chase a fantasy of invincibility, only to be buried under the rubble of the very empire it was meant to save. The world's biggest gun left nothing behind but a crater in the earth and a warning to the future that greatness is never measured in tons of steel alone. April 14, 1945, in the dense, silent forests near Oberlichtenau, German-American soldiers stumbled upon a scene that defied conventional military logic. Spread across the landscape were the mangled, scorched remains of what appeared to be a railway system built for giants. Huge, multi-axle bogies lay overturned like dead beetles, and massive steel tubes, wide enough for a man to crawl through, were twisted by demolition charges. This was the final graveyard of Schwerer Gustav, the sister gun to Dora, and the most tangible evidence of a regime that had traded its sanity for the pursuit of the impossible. The discovery occurred at roughly 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, and as the GIs climbed over the wreckage, they weren't looking at a weapon of war so much as a monument to a terminal delusion. The story of the Dora gun is often told through the lens of engineering superlatives, focusing on the sheer weight of its shells or the incredible pressure within its barrel. But as we look back from the distance of nearly a century, the legacy of this weapon is far more profound than its ballistic capabilities. It represents the ultimate manifestation of hubris, a physical expression of the belief that scale could somehow compensate for a failing strategy. While the Allies were perfecting the mass production of versatile tanks and the logistics of global supply chains, the German High Command was pouring millions of man-hours and thousands of tons of high-grade steel into a weapon that could barely be moved, let alone used effectively in a dynamic theater of war. Consider the staggering opportunity cost of this steel behemoth. At a time when the Luftwaffe was screaming for more fighter planes, and the panzer divisions were being thinned out on the Eastern Front, Hitler was obsessed with a gun that required a literal army of its own just to function. By the time Dora was ready to fire at Sevastopol, the era of static siege warfare was already a relic of the past. The world had moved on to the age of the aircraft carrier and the long-range bomber, yet the Third Reich remained anchored to the 19th century concept of the Great Siege Engine. It was a weapon designed for a world that no longer existed, built by a regime that refused to accept the reality of its own decline. The men who operated Dora, who labored in the heat and the dust at 11 a.m., under the shadow of its gargantuan barrel, were part of a ritual of futility. They were the acolytes of a machine that demanded everything and gave almost nothing in return. For every shell that impacted the Crimean earth, a fortune in resources had been vanished from the German war effort. It is estimated that the cost of developing and maintaining the Gustav-class guns could have equipped several entire armored divisions. Those divisions might have changed the course of a battle, but Dora could only create a spectacular explosion and a very deep hole in the ground. This brings us to the deeper historical reflection on why such weapons are built. Totalitarian regimes often find themselves seduced by the Wunderwaffe or wonder weapon myth. When a leadership is insulated from reality and fed by a cult of personality, the spectacular is prioritized over the practical. A weapon like Dora is not just a tool, it is a propaganda piece made of iron. It is intended to overawe the enemy and reassure the faithful that their cause is backed by an almost supernatural technological superiority. Yet, history shows us that the more a nation leans into these monolithic curiosities, the closer it is to its own collapse. The complexity of Dora was its greatest weakness. It was too heavy for most bridges, too large for most tunnels, and too slow to escape the inevitable tide of the advancing Red Army. By 6:45 p.m. on that April evening in 1945, the sun was setting over the ruins of a weapon that was supposed to ensure a 1,000-year reign. Instead, the scrap metal would eventually be hauled away to be melted down into the foundations of a new, divided Europe. The legacy of Dora is a warning to all who believe that sheer power and massive scale are substitutes for wisdom and sustainable objectives. It reminds us that technology, when divorced from morality and practical reality, becomes a trap for its creators. We look back at the photos of Dora today and see a ghost, a haunting image of what happens when engineering is harnessed by madness. It was a weapon of incredible sophistication and zero utility, a masterpiece of design and a catastrophe of judgment. As the thunder of its last shot echoed into the annals of history, it left behind a profound lesson. True strength is not found in the size of a barrel or the weight of a projectile, but in the resilience of a society and the clarity of its purpose. The biggest gun ever built did not win the war. It only served to illustrate the depth of the hole Hitler had dug for his own people. In the quiet of the forest where its remains were found, the only thing left was the realization that greatness cannot be forged in steel alone, and that the most expensive weapons are often the ones that never should have been built at all.